storyboard artist Lincoln Adams, and welcome back to this week's conversation on composition. Last week, we talked about Norman Rockwell and how effective he was at using shape and scale and compositional elements to point us where he wanted our eye to move throughout the image. This week, we're going to talk about the all-time classic film, Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles and filmed by the innovative Greg Toland. Together they formed a very unique partnership that really set the stage for all the film that we see today. Most would say there's movies before Citizen Kane and movies after Citizen Kane, which is not to diminish some of the classic films that were innovative in the silent film era or even the first talkies, but Citizen Kane really took composition and camera angles and crafted something that was very, very thematically different. We felt very, very different, and the film was deeper and bigger in scope and scale. And it was due to camera placement, due to composition. So we are going to take a look at one of the first scenes in the film. We'll watch the film, and then I'll break it down shot by shot a little bit, and then I'll do a kind of draw over that shows how these compositional elements really work and how characters are framed. So without any further ado, let's take a deep dive in a film study breakdown of Citizen Kane.
Charles.
Kane.
Pull your muffler around your neck, Charles.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes. I'll sign those papers now, Mr. Thatcher.
You people seem to forget that I'm the boy's father.
It's going to be done exactly the way I've told Mr. Thatcher.
There ain't nothing wrong with Colorado. I don't see why we can't raise our own son just because we come into some money. If I want, I can go to court. A father has a right to. A boarder that beats his bill and leaves worthless stock behind. That property is just as much my property as anybody's, now that it's valuable. And if Fred Graves had any idea all this was going to happen, he'd have made out those certificates in both our names.
However, they were made out in Mrs. Kane's name.
He owed the money for the board to the both of us.
The bank's decision on all matters concerning...
I don't hold with signing my boy away to any bank as guardian.
I want you to
just
stop
because...
all this nonsense,
The bank's
Jim.
decision on all matters concerning his education, his places of residence, and similar subjects is to be final.
The idea of a bank being the guardian.
I want you to stop all this nonsense, Jim.
We will assume full management of the Colorado load, of which I repeat, Mrs. Kane, you are the sole owner.
Where do I sign, Mr. Thatcher?
Right here, Mrs. Kane.
Mary, I'm asking you for the last time. Anybody'd think I hadn't been a good
The sum of
husband, a father.
$50,000 a year is to be paid to you and Mr. Kane as long as you both live, and thereafter to the survivor.
Well, let's hope it's all for the best.
It is.
The Union forever! The Catholic anti-Jack!
Why I can't raise my own boy is more than I can understand.
Go on, Mr. Thatcher.
Everything else, the principal as well as all monies earned, is to be administered by the bank in trust for your son, Charles Foster Kane, until he reaches his 25th birthday, at which time he is to come into complete possession.
Charles! Go on, Mr. Thatcher.
Well, it's almost 5, Mrs. Kane. Don't you think I'd better meet the boy?
I've got his trunk all packed. I've had it packed for a week now.
I've arranged for a tutor to meet us in Chicago. I brought him here with me, but...
Charles! Looky, Mom!
Better come inside, son.
Well, that's quite a snowman. Did you make it all by yourself, my lad?
Maybe I'll make some teeth and whiskers.
This is Mr. Thatcher, Charles.
Oh.
How do you do, Charles?
He comes from the east.
Wow.
Hello, Charlie.
Charles?
Yes, Mummy?
Mr. Thatcher's going to take you on a trip with him tonight. You'll be leaving on number 10.
That's the train with all the lights on it.
You going, Mom?
Well, no, your mother won't be going right away, Charles, but she'll be...
Where am I going?
You're going to see Chicago and New York and Washington, maybe. Ain't he, Mr. Thatcher?
He certainly is. I wish I were a little boy going on a trip like that for the first time.
Why aren't you coming with us, Mom?
We have to stay here, Charles.
You're going to live with Mr. Thatcher from now on, Charlie. You're going to be rich. Your ma figures, well, that is, me and her decided this ain't the place for you to grow up in. You'll probably be the richest man in America someday, and you ought to
won't be
get an
lonely,
education.
Charles.
Lonely, of course not. Why, we're going to have some fine times together. Really, we are, Charles. Now, shall we shake hands? Oh, come. I'm not as frightening as all that, am I? Now, what do you say? Let's shake.
Why, Charles.
Charles, you almost hurt me. What's
Charles,
that under
Charlie.
his pillow? It's that to lay with.
You're... I'm sorry, Mr. Thatcher. What that kid needs is a good thrashing.
That's what you think, is it, Jim?
Yes.
That's why he's going to be brought up where you can't get at him.
All right, there was a lot to unpack in that scene, and so this was set the stage here. So Charles Foster Kane has died, and we're now going back into his past to understand where he may have come from. He's a mysterious fellow, and here we find him
Charles.
Kane.
Pull your muffler around your neck,
as a kid.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes. I'll sign those papers now,
I
Mr. Thatcher.
love how Greg
You people
Toland
seem to forget that I'm the boy's
pulls
father.
back
It's going to be
here
done exactly the way I
with
told
the
Mr.
camera.
Thatcher.
There ain't nothing wrong with
This is what we
Colorado.
call classic
I don't see why we
oneer.
can't raise our own son just because
And I think
into
something
some
that's
money.
really important that's
If I
going
want,
on
I can
here,
go to court. A
and
father
this is
has
where
a
we'll
right to
settle on our
a board
composition
that beats his
study,
bill and leaves worthless
is
stock
is
behind.
just how
That property is just as
effortless,
much my property as anybody's, now that it's valuable.
just how
And if Fred
effortless
Graves had
the
any idea all this was
reframing
going to happen, he'd have
is.
made out those certificates in both
So
our names.
let's
Well,
just
they were made out in
take a
Mrs.
look
Kane's
at
name.
that.
He
I'm
owed
going
the
to
money
scrub
to the
back
board, to
here,
both of us. The bank's
and
decision
we're
on
going
all
to see
matters
how
must be
effortless the framing of the camera is to reset the deck. Okay, so let's take a look. We have this dissolve from a letter that's being read about Mr. Kane. There's a reporter reading this, and so this sort of, he's kind of unpacking this in his mind, this history. And so here we have this. It starts out with little Charles Foster Kane on his sled. Okay, and so idyllic cut here. This is Kane's boarding house. We know exactly where we are. Ah, here we go. Right now we see his mother enter the frame, and it went from being a nice wide shot of Charles with the snowman and having fun and snowball fighting to now he's small. It's a two shot over the shoulder, and it's really he seems very small now. And you can see this transference of power going to his mother here.
Charles.
Camera slowly pulling out.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes.
Elegant.
I'll sign those papers now, Mr. Thatcher.
And we're going to continue to pull out here as we're introduced to Mr. Thatcher, the banker here, and Charles's father here. And even from this early stage of the camera pulling out, it's going to establish something we're going to talk quite a bit about. And it's this pushing aside of the father here, and how the power is centered between Mr. Thatcher and Mrs. Kane.
You people seem to forget that I'm the boy's father.
It's going to be done exactly the way I told Mr. Thatcher.
There ain't nothing wrong with Colorado. I don't see why we can't raise our own son just because we come into some money. If I want, I can go to court. A father has a right to. A boarder that beats his bill and leaves.
Now look at this very closely. This is very, very important. All of that has now, this camera pulling out has reframed everyone. Charles is almost like a bird in a cage, and he stays in this shot, in this framing throughout the entirety of the scene, and while they talk about him. So he is very much a bird in a cage here. And what we have is Mr. Thatcher, who's going over paperwork here. There was a boarder that lived or stayed here in their boarding house, and he paid for his stay by signing a lease over to them, a lease to his property, to pay for his stay at the boarding house. what they discover is that this lease that they've paid him with is sitting on top of a gold mine, a black gold mine. It's oil, and so here they are. They are the recipients of all of the contents of that property, including what's underneath it. And the mom here, Mary, and Mr. Thatcher have decided that they will cede control over to Charles. Not Dad. Charles. Not Dad. So pay close attention here to the size and the frame, and we'll unpack this a little bit more as we go. But just keep this in mind here. The people who are largest in the frame, Mom and Mr. Thatcher, Birdcage Charles, and here we have Dad.
Was stuck behind. That property is just as much my property as anybody's, now that it's valuable. And if Fred Graves had any idea all this was going to happen, he'd have made out those certificates in both our names.
However, they were made out in Mrs. Kane's name.
He owed the money for the board to the both of us.
The bank's decision on all matters
I
concerning
don't hold with signing my boy away to any banker's guardian.
I want you to
just
stop
because.
all this nonsense,
The bank's
Jim.
decision on all matters concerning his education, his places of residence, and similar subjects is to be
The
final.
idea of a bank being the guardian.
I want you to stop all this nonsense, Jim.
We will assume full management of the Colorado load, of which I repeat, Mrs. Kane, you are the sole owner.
Where do I sign, Mr. Thatcher?
Right here, Mrs. Kane.
Mary, I'm asking you for the last time.
I love here, we reframe the camera just a little bit, and it now looks like the dad has a little bit of power or status, whereas before he was kind of crammed into the corner here. But it's false. But at least he makes this attempt at, I'm begging you for the last time here. And now Mary and Mr. Thatcher sort of shrink in the frame.
Anybody think I hadn't been a good
The sum
husband,
of
a father?
$50,000 a year is to be paid to you and Mr. Kane as long as you both live, and thereafter to the survivor.
Well, let's hope it's all for the best.
It is.
Look how false that was. As soon as Thatcher says that these two are going to get paid $50,000 a year for the rest of their lives, and think about that for a moment. $50,000 in 1875 is probably like getting $1 million a year today, every year for the rest of your life. And he immediately he's like, let's hope it's for the best. So this tells us a whole lot about his character here. And now the camera pans down and we can kind of see the real power brokers in this scene are Mary, who is the largest, and Mr. Thatcher. And they're signing the paperwork here. So this is a very interesting framing. And again, we still see this dynamic of Charles, sort of a bird, this scale relationship here. The other thing to notice too is that these two were wearing black, whereas the dad was wearing this sort of gray. And so this sort of black, you could say it's a black hat sort of villain thing, but I don't really think it is. I just think they're very cut and dry, black and white, no nonsense. It's this, it's that. And I think the dad sort of blends into the background. And I think that's essentially how he's going to be as this figure blended into the background.
Why I can't raise my own boy is more than I can understand.
Go on, Mr.
Camera
Thatcher.
pans up.
Everything else, the principal as well as all monies earned, is to be administered by the bank in trust
Now
for
the
your son,
camera
Charles
is
Foster Kane,
tracking with
till he
them.
reaches his 25th birthday, at which time...
This is the first cut. After the snowball hitting the sign, this is the first cut. And where we really see just status and scale, like we talked about with Norman Rockwell last week, status and scale. She is the biggest, and the two men really are the bit players, ultimately. Now, Mr. Thatcher gets a little bit more space to roam here in this shot, but really, Dad is isolated in this corner between her Princess Leia bun and the frame.
He is to come into complete possession.
Charles! Go on, Mr. Thatcher.
Well, It's almost 5, Mrs. Kane. Don't you think I'd better meet the boy?
I've got his trunk all packed.
She's so dead-eyed here.
I've had it packed for a week now.
Oh, this is the best. Look at this edit. It's one shot. It's a oneer. Look at that camera pulls out as they walk out. It's so seamless. I mean,
Did you make that all by yourself, my lad?
people do their best to try and cut that together.
This is Mr. Thatcher, Charles.
Special effects, but that's just
How do you do,
beautiful.
Charles?
Beautiful
He
blocking,
comes from
beautiful
the
stage.
east. Hello, Charlie.
Charles?
And again, look at the status here. Look at the status. We still have the dad's a bit player in this. He's pushed in the background. We have Mr. Thatcher and Mom are huge in the frame. And this is the first time we're getting to really hear Charles speak and emote here. But he's still a bit, almost a bit player in this situation as well. And I think that's sort of the theme that we're getting at here.
Mr. Thatcher's going to...
And even more so, he's a bit player because he's smaller than this triangle, that we've got going here. But now he is almost equal, at the very least, to Mr. Thatcher and Mom. They're on the same plane. I love how we've got, this line from the boarding house pointing to, the angle of Thatcher's nose, which points right down here. And Charles, the brim of his hat points up to Mom, which hits her right in the eyes. It's a beautiful piece of composition here. I mean, golly, I could spend the rest of my life trying to compose that well. That's pure genius there.
You on a trip with him tonight. You'll be leaving on number 10.
That's the train with all the lights on it.
You going, Mom?
Well, no, your mother won't be going right away, Charles, but she'll be...
Where am I going?
You're going to see Chicago and New York
On a
and
side note,
Washington,
this kid
maybe.
looks
Ain't he,
exactly
Mr.
like
Thatcher?
Orson
He
Welles.
certainly
I'd
is.
love to
I
see
wish I were
Orson
a little
Welles
boy
as a
going on a
kid.
trip like that for the first
This
time.
looks exactly like
Why aren't you
Orson
going with
Welles
us, Mom?
being
We
not
have to
just the
stay here,
director,
Charles.
but the man.
You're going to live with Mr.
Play the
Thatcher
role
from
of
now on,
the
Charlie.
adult
You're going to be rich.
Charles
Your
Foster
mom
Kane.
figures, well, that is, me and her decided this ain't the place for you to grow
Yeah.
up in.
You
You'll
and
probably be
Mom.
the richest man in America someday, and you
You
ought to
won't be
get an
lonely,
education.
Charles.
Lonely, of course not. Why, we're going to have some fine times together, really. we
Ooh, I
are, Charles.
love
Now,
that
shall we
fierceness.
shake
Look at
hands?
that. Ooh.
Come. I'm not as
Ooh.
frightening as all that, am I? Now, what do you say? Let's shake.
Why,
Well,
Charles.
Charles, you almost hurt me. Let's shake them.
It's a lot of foreshadowing here between those two. Those of you who haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it.
I'm sorry, Mr. Thatcher. What that kid needs is a good thrashing.
That's what you think, is it, Jim?
Yes.
That's why he's going to be brought up where you can't get at him.
Look at that stern look. Some more foreshadowing. For those of you who've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. So, this is amazing work here. The next thing that we're going to look at is we're going to go back to the interior scene and discuss in depth just the dynamics of the one-shot composition. So here we are with our color-coded breakdown of the scene from the interior, starting with looking at how young Charles Foster is kind of framed in that window. That was something we talked about earlier as the camera sort of pulled out from there. And that's, for me, the highest contrast in the scene, so I kind of left that black and white so that we could see that. Now, moving on, for me, the next bit of the composition that takes hierarchical precedence and will kind of maintain this hierarchical precedence is Mr. Thatcher and Mrs. Kane. And it's because of their size in the frame. So I kind of moved from Charles, who keeps floating around the little birdcage, right over into the business of what Mr. Thatcher and Mrs. Kane are doing. And they're keep moving their hands back and forth, signing their paperwork. And so they're very, very busy, and they're very large in the screen. They take up most of the frame, really almost about half of it from the background. But when you kind of divide it up here, it's like they take up most of the space, the background space, and Charles. And then you've got Dad standing over here in the corner, and he's wedged in between this doorway and the window. And you can see by his posture, the shoulders are up, He's tense, the hand is clenched. He's literally framed within Mr. Thatcher's hat here, which I think is absolutely incredible composition. He's literally being owned by the man here. So this to me is just a tremendous piece of composition. We just tell the story all in this shot. And I think it's important for me to remember as a board artist, and really for anyone, is that modern cinema can be very, very cut heavy. I have a tendency to be very, very cut heavy. And I think when I step back and realize, man, if I just have strong composition, good staging, and good blocking, as this shot has, I mean, there's 4 whole cuts in the whole scene, then you can really go a long way with telling a really compelling story. So it's a good reminder for me. And again, we can kind of see how the eye flow works. And this is what makes it work. And you have to have this kind of good eye flow because you're going to sit on this shot for quite some time within the sequence here. Kind of follow through Charles here and flow out again to Mr. Thatcher, Mrs. Kane. Look at the papers, even that highlight on the more papers come up through because Dad is again framed within that stove-top hat. Follow through his eyes as he's delivering dialogue, and then you come back down because we're motivated to move back down because of the high key contrast and the fact that Charles is still moving. And then we just sort of cycle back and through this whole time. And we're never really bored. You know, even the movement is hierarchical. You know, he's small enough, and we keep him alive back there. Union forever! You know, these little fun things. He's still a kid. You know, highly contrasted by the business that's going on inside. It's a magnificent shot. And yes, it's an old film, but these principles just don't go away. I think, for me, when I compare this to, say, someone like a Roger Deakins, who's my favorite cinematographer, these things don't change. The type of stories we tell change, the way that we use the technology of cameras and digital work changes, and certainly the overall style of films, the mise-en-scene, as it were, topically, which changes all of that environment, you know, all of that stuff changes and has changed. But overall, good composition, good staging, good acting, good blocking, those things never go out of fashion. And if for me, if I continue to do that, and for anybody else, as a filmmaker or a board artist, we continue to plug away at that, got a real good shot at making something that's reasonably entertaining. Well, thanks for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed our conversation on Citizen Kane and that you got some new insight on how composition works for film. Next week, we'll continue with part 3, where I'll discuss some of my own ideas and thoughts in how I've broken down my own storyboards for context and emotions and story. If you liked what you saw here, feel free to subscribe and hit the like button. And in the meantime, till we talk again, make sure to keep drawing those stories that are right outside your door.